Welcome to a Thanksgiving episode of In My Experience. This is unfortunately going to come out after the Thanksgiving holiday, but it's on our minds this week because we're recording it before Thanksgiving. So that's the topic of this episode. But before we dive into that, let's do our usual life update with COVID. How about you, Noah?
Gosh, I'm trying to think what... I know that so much has changed because I remember in our last episode when I was editing it, I edited about a week ago, and I was like, did he really just say it's not on his mind, that it's not a big thing? But then I went back and kind of pulled up some of the data, and I was like, oh yeah, it has changed a lot in a week. And now it's been 2 weeks since we've recorded that episode, and cases have spiked like crazy. And not just cases, hospitalizations and deaths. Deaths and hospitalizations not as much as cases, but they're still spiking as well.
Yeah, I believe our state is nearly full on hospital beds currently, which is a good reason to not get sick.
Yeah, well, and especially going into Thanksgiving where people are going to be traveling a lot. It's concerning.
Yes.
And so, me personally, I suppose I've gotten tested and got a negative result in that time because my university offered testing to anyone who wanted it, basically before they went home, which just makes a lot of sense, so that's nice. But other than that, I suppose I haven't really been having a whole lot of interface. I've been spending a lot of time just kind of alone working. It's been a very busy 2 weeks for me, so I haven't actually got out of my room much, not necessarily even for pandemic reasons, just for I'm busy reasons.
Yeah. I was reading just last week Friday that 1 in 100 Americans is currently contagious with the coronavirus, which is a lot.
Gosh, that's crazy.
Yeah. And so this is the worst the pandemic has been since the beginning of the pandemic, but we are nowhere near as bad as we could be. And so I think that a lot of people, because the previous spikes of COVID have gone back down, assume that this one will. But with Thanksgiving travel happening in the middle of the spike, and the fact that current numbers are usually about 2 weeks behind the actual situation on the ground, I think that it's going to get a lot worse over the next month, and people just fail to recognize how much worse it can get. So I, as well, isolated for 2 weeks before I came home because I don't have the same access to testing, and had to have a rather awkward interaction with my roommate's mother, who wanted me to come in for dinner and wanted to give me a hug, and I was like, I really don't feel comfortable doing that. I'm sorry. It is strange. A lot of people are just all quarantined out. They can't take any more isolation, but now is really the worst that it's ever been, and now is when isolation is most important.
Yeah, and I really feel for people in that it has been a long time and people are burnt out of it, and it really sucks to, think about maybe not seeing people at Thanksgiving like they're used to. But I think that, there is an end in sight. There is going to be an end to this. We just have to make it to that. This is not forever. Mm-hmm. And so we can make it to when it is safe, and should not be making decisions of, even sometimes I hear people in places of power, not even just, friends, but talking about lifting restrictions or how things should be done, not in terms of cases or spread or stuff like that, but they're like, we've been doing this for X number of months, and it's that's not the data point you should be looking at. That has nothing to do with how long you have had to wear a mask. Has nothing to do with whether you should keep wearing one.
Yes. The immediate analogy that comes to mind is war. I mean, what if Abraham Lincoln said, well, we've been fighting the war for 3 years, so we're going to declare that we won and stop fighting? It doesn't make sense. You've got to see it through to the end, even though it is difficult.
Yeah, and the thing is, we, to kind of bring it to maybe something that is to be thankful about, there actually is a seeming end, or at least, lessening of severity in sight. The, vaccines, there's a lot of promise in the two vaccines that are, hopefully going to be soon available to some people. But that's, they're not going to be a huge force for a couple months now. So if we can make it through that couple months, if we can make it to spring where vaccines will hopefully be tested, God willing, effective, and more widely available, then we will see things start to go, it will get better then. Vaccination works, but we need to get there. We're not there yet.
Yes, and I think the fact that there is an end in sight where vaccines can bring this pandemic to an end makes keeping cases down all the more important, because those deaths are very preventable.
Yeah.
It's not that they were going to get COVID at some point. There is an end in sight where no one has to get COVID because there's vaccines. The Pfizer and Moderna vaccines in the United States, the news broke about those a few weeks ago now, are 90 and 95% effective, which is amazing for a vaccine against a coronavirus, like a cold or a flu.
I think that we're kind of so used to we don't really hear about vaccines like working or not. We're just kind of so used to like, these are the vaccines that work and that we use. And, the general public isn't super exposed to kind of vaccine research. But there was a legitimate concern that a vaccine might just not work or not work for very long. Like you might get a vaccine that would last 3 months and then your immunity would fade. Like that was a legitimate, real concern that was had.
Yes.
And it seems that hopefully it's looking very positive that is not the case.
And what I think, recent news that I think is even more exciting, the University of Cambridge's vaccine recently published results that indicate, well, of the two trials, one was 65% effective and one was 90% effective. There were slightly different applications between the two trials. But that vaccine only costs $3 or $4, and they expect to be able to produce 3 billion doses in 2021.
Oh, wow.
Of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines in the United States, they're only expecting to produce 1 billion doses in 2021, which would be enough for the United States, but it's not enough for the world. And so this University of Cambridge vaccine is significantly cheaper, and we can make significantly more of it, which is a very good thing.
Yeah, and do you know if those I know that some vaccines require 2 administrations?
Yes, so the University of Cambridge vaccine requires, or in the trial that was 90% effective, they accidentally gave the participants a half dose the first time, and then gave them a full dose the second time, and that happened to be 90% effective. And so there is some questioning whether that data is reliable, seeing as it was a mistake. But if that is a viable option, that would be really good. And what's more, that vaccine can be kept at regular refrigeration temperature and not the -80.
Oh, yeah, that's really big. That's huge, because some vaccines require very, very specialty freezers.
Yes, especially for distribution to poor countries that need that cheaper vaccine, making it refrigerated at standard temperatures so that it can be carried in with a truck of fish or something is important. The Coca-Cola company delivers Coca-Cola to more countries than are in the United Nations. Often delivers Coca-Cola in refrigerated trucks. The single biggest public health benefit that the third world has seen is the fact that Coca-Cola has carried vaccines for free in their refrigerated trucks. The Gates Foundation has saved billions of dollars on making a refrigerated logistics network because the Coca-Cola company lets them keep vaccines in their trucks.
Coca-Cola already has one.
Yes. Coca-Cola already delivers refrigerated items to just about every person on Earth. And the fact that they're willing to carry vaccines for free has saved millions of lives.
Well, I mean, I suppose right there is a good tangential benefit of capitalism.
Yes, absolutely.
There's money to be had in Coca-Cola, and there's refrigeration required for it.
What we wanted to talk about in this episode is Thanksgiving. This is our Thanksgiving episode, and I wanted to open with a bit of a history of the holiday. So, Thanksgiving festivals are a very old tradition in human cultures, especially in the fall, around harvest time. Even going back to the 15th century, there were Spanish and Portuguese Thanksgiving festivals. When the settlers arrived at Plymouth Plantation in Massachusetts, one of the reasons that they invited about 100 Native Americans to join them for Thanksgiving is because the natives also had a Thanksgiving festival of some sort. They celebrated the harvest and the bounty of fall with a big festival. And so it was an opportunity for the Pilgrims from England and the Native Americans to come together and celebrate their Thanksgiving harvest festival together, because it's something that both their cultures shared. In the United States, Thanksgiving festivals continued at the state level and kind of sporadically through the nation's founding. One of the first things that George Washington did as president was declare a Thanksgiving holiday. It was in February, and it was like a Saturday or something. But as president, he's like, let's give thanks for having a nation, and he declared a day of Thanksgiving. That kind of sporadic, the president or Congress or the governor, whenever they feel moved, will declare a Thanksgiving holiday. That type of holiday celebration continued up until the 1870s. But in 1860, President Abraham Lincoln, in the midst of the Civil War, declared a Thanksgiving holiday in the end of November, and continued to do that every year for the rest of the war. And it became a tradition among the presidency that you just declare a Thanksgiving holiday for the last Thursday in November. It was eventually signed into law along with other federal holidays, such as Christmas, New Year's, and 4th of July. Actually, I believe it was those four. Christmas, New Year's, 4th of July, and Thanksgiving were the first four official federal holidays in the 1870s or 1890s. I don't remember the date, so don't quote me on it. But Congress first signed that into law, and when it was first signed into law, Thanksgiving was the last Thursday in November. And it continued like that up until the 1930s, when President Roosevelt, to combat the Great Depression, decided to move Thanksgiving to the fourth Thursday in November, because that year was the first year in a long time when November had 5 Thursdays. So he decided to make Thanksgiving the fourth Thursday instead of the fifth Thursday, as would have been normal. And it was a huge controversy. Roosevelt's justification for it was that he can extend the holiday shopping season by an extra week and try to lift the United States out of the Great Depression. Obviously, the Republicans hated that, and they thought that Roosevelt was, desecrating this sacred tradition that had been put in place by Abraham Lincoln himself of having Thanksgiving on the last Thursday in November. And so FDR still went ahead and declared the fourth Thursday in November as Thanksgiving, and only 22 states did that. The rest of the states ignored his declaration and continued to celebrate Thanksgiving on the fifth Thursday in November. And it happened again later on in FDR's term, I think 2 or 3 years later, and to the same results. Eventually, in 1950, I want to say, Congress agreed that the fourth Thursday in November was the right time for Thanksgiving. But for 30 years of American politics, which Thursday to celebrate the holiday of Thanksgiving on was a serious partisan issue. So
I'm laughing, but that's just so ridiculous. Which Thursday? It's just like, really?
It was a big deal. People were very upset about the fact that FDR wanted to make it the fourth Thursday instead of the fifth Thursday. More recently, Native American activism has tried to make Thanksgiving into a national day of mourning for the genocide of Native Americans, which I think is a good thing. However, within the Native American community, there's quite a bit of disagreement about that. As I mentioned, the reason that Thanksgiving was a holiday for the Pilgrims, or one of the reasons it was a holiday, was because Native Americans have celebrated Thanksgivings since before the Europeans arrived. And so, in this sense, it shows the melting pot-ness of America, that celebrating a Thanksgiving festival in the fall is a Native American tradition that we continue to do today. And, it's probably not great that we tend to gloss over the genocide and the whitewashing in some sense of our culture, but many Native American activists actually say, no, Thanksgiving is great because this is an example of Native American culture in American culture.
Yeah.
And so that is been a controversy for the last 50, 60 years, is whether Native Americans can support Thanksgiving as a holiday. Personally, I think we can hold both at the same time. A recognition of the unparalleled destruction of human societies that the Columbian Exchange brought about, and also that Thanksgiving is a unique cultural expression of Native American holidays in the United States.
Yeah, no, I think that, most certainly, even in day-to-day culture or in how we talk about the history of our country, I think that we don't acknowledge that we have done horrible, horrible things directly and indirectly to get to where we are now.
Yes. And
I think that, I would be at the camp that, maybe there's an element here that we need to, I don't know if it's designate another day or find ways to, like you said, hold both. And whether that is holding both on the same day or finding another time to acknowledge and mourn what was done.
Yes. For example, Columbus Day has largely been...
Yeah, that one's a bit more pointed.
Yes. Columbus Day is clearly a holiday that we should not be celebrating. Columbus himself, in his own time, was a failure. But using that as a celebration of Native Peoples Day has become a much more common holiday, and I think that's a good one.
Yeah, most definitely.
It's interesting that we're talking about this. I am currently taking a class on European indigenous encounters in the Americas, and looking at the Columbian Exchange and the devastation it brought to the American Indian populations here has been a personal interest, and the class has really fed into that, which I appreciate. I'm going to recommend my textbook from the class, It's Paul Kelton's Epidemics and Enslavement, Biological Catastrophe in the Native Southeast. This is published, I believe, through the University of Nebraska Press. It's a very interesting look at how European diseases played out in indigenous communities. And the point that he makes in the book, which I find rather convincing, is that native populations were reduced in some places up to 99% by European diseases. And his argument is that was not inevitable. Native Americans had a number of diseases endemic to the Americas, but their suffering from constant disease and population loss is not because they didn't have good immune systems, they didn't deal with disease, not because the European diseases were new, but because the conditions that the Europeans' colonization placed them in, forcing them to huddle in more condensed settlements instead of their more dispersed settlements like they might like. They often suffered malnutrition and warfare and slavery from Europeans, and that those stressors and poor living conditions that the Europeans caused for the Native American populations is really what made them susceptible to the diseases, and not necessarily that they hadn't seen it before. Europeans suffered from smallpox, and they were European, right? Native Americans suffer from smallpox, but their epidemics were awful, not because the Native American populations haven't seen smallpox before, but because Native American populations were often crammed into poor living conditions, malnourished, that sort of thing.
It's probably a combination of both. From what it sounds like, that's kind of a pushback against the classic Jared Diamond guns, germs, and steel perspective of
Yes, it is.
That it was so devastating just because there were no large cities in the Americas, or there were large cities but not as many, and so there wasn't this kind of spread of pandemic diseases. I would imagine it's both. It's probably some that just the lifestyle of Native Americans means that disease probably wasn't as big of a factor. But also when it's not just, there was an introduction by some ship that landed, there's multiple introductions, and it's not that were associated with violent intrusion. Mm-hmm. You're going to have a much worse effect.
Yes, absolutely. So this is a bit of a tangent from a Thanksgiving-themed episode, but I wanted to say, the genocide of Native peoples in the Americas is a fascinating topic to me. I recommend Paul Keaton's book if you're interested in hearing about how disease plays a role in that.
Yeah. Well, no, and I think that there's an element of, like you mentioned earlier, trying to hold both things together, at the same time. Be thankful for what we have, but also acknowledge that there are elements of that kind of cultural piece that are not as bright and shining as we might imagine them to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The classic Thanksgiving question is, what are you thankful for this year, Noah? It's been an awful year to start out with. 2020 has been a horrible year. And that's not just me speaking as an inexperienced young person.
No.
I know people in their 80s or 90s who said, I have never seen a year as bad as 2020.
Yeah, it's been brutal. But I think there are still things to be thankful for.
Absolutely.
This podcast is actually kind of a facet of one of the things I'm thankful for, and that it's been kind of rekindling some of the connections to people I know from high school. Mm-hmm. James and I know each other from high school. We go to different universities now. And it's not just me and you. I've talked a lot more with a lot of my other high school friends over Zoom and stuff like that. We actually just started a D&D campaign with some people from high school,
which I'm very excited about.
Yeah, I'm thankful that I think the shift to more virtual interactions has meant that I wasn't as limited in who I hung out with by my location. And so I connected back with a lot of high school friends, which has been really rewarding.
Certainly. The first formal repeating Thanksgiving was initiated by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, probably the darkest period of American history. Some estimates say 3% of the United States population died between 1860 and 1865. It was an awful time. And so harsh times can really bring into beautiful contrast the things in our life that are good that we should be thankful for. I am currently home for Thanksgiving. I lived here for the most of the summer and the spring. I'm really thankful for my family. I think, as a 19-year-old, I'm eager to get out of the house, obviously, but appreciating the the environment I was raised in, especially in light of how it has prepared me to deal with hardships like this and the security of my family. I'm thankful for it in a way this year that I have not been in the past.
I definitely feel that too. And I think part of that is the situation of the world. And I think part of that is just an element of growing older and becoming more mature and reflecting back. And that I know that like my family, I love my parents. They're great. But our family was not like trying to come up with, like we didn't do as much together as I know other families do, which is fine. But I think that even though I haven't been seeing my family as much, it's when I lived at home, obviously. When I am home now, I'm more kind of present. When I lived at home, I would spend a lot of time in my room, or I would be out of the house at someone else's house or at school or whatever, doing something else. But now when I'm home, I spend much more time just down in the living room, chatting with people, watching TV, whatever. I think that it's kind of funny. If I'm home for a Saturday now, I spend more time with my family than when I lived there if I was home for a Saturday. And so I've definitely kind of appreciated that.
A common theme, I guess I can pull from both of that is the intentionality, right? This year has made so many things in our life hard, and it's made us recognize what is valuable and forced us to be intentional about pursuing it, whether that is family or friendships or whatever.
Yeah, because, you've got to make choices sometimes just because, like, you have to limit the people that you can interact with, so you have to kind of pick and choose how and when you're going to do that. And I know for both of us, we have been very, very busy.
Yes.
And so times when we are not busy, what we choose to do at that time, I think we are forced to kind of think about if it is what we want to be doing. Whereas I know, like my freshman year and sometimes in high school, like I would just have a lot of free time because I was never super bogged down by schoolwork, and that I could usually BS my way through it, or, I was a smart kid. School was not the hardest for me.
We're smart kids. High school was not a challenge.
Yeah. I got lucky in terms of genetics.
Yes.
Like on Saturdays, almost every Saturday, I see my girlfriend. And that's really the only time we get to see each other in person, every Saturday. And that's really nice. And I'd see her more when she doesn't go to the same university that I do. So when we were in high school together, we would see each other more often in person. But I think that now there's kind of like this, like Saturdays are my day off. This is when I take the most time consistently off of doing work. It's kind of forced me to, really look forward to that time, maybe, and appreciate it more than maybe that I would have if I had more free time.
Yeah, certainly. Another thing I'm thankful for that I kind of touched on in our last episode is the way that coming home and being forced to do nothing for such a long time meant I couldn't ignore a lot of problems in my life, and I had to address them. I was thinking specifically of my emotional and mental health. I was kind of a mess back in late March, early April, but I didn't have anywhere to go. I couldn't distract myself. I couldn't ignore it or push it down anymore because there's nothing else to do. And so I was forced to sit in that and actually deal with it. And so I've been thankful for the time that this year has afforded me for self-growth, even though it is painful.
Yeah, there's an element that sometimes, even when things are really hard, a breaking point can be a turning point.
Yes.
That sometimes you need to be on the edge to make a change.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Also, how we touched on in our last episode, and a little bit like I mentioned with our high school friends, if I'm trying to think back on the things in my life that I'm thankful for, how I got to where I am now, a big one of those is our high school friends, our group of dudes.
Yeah. That,
kind of allowed us to decide who we want to be, figure out our identities and what it means to be a man and just to be a person in a space where anything goes, really, in terms of adaptive identities. But if things are maladaptive, if you're doing something that isn't good for you, you're going to get kindly called out for it. And not just in our dudes, but in our whole friend group. I think that was really prevalent. And I know that I would not be the person that I am now if I didn't have such a great group of high school friends.
Yeah. Overall, this year has taken a lot from us, but the things that are most important have stuck around, and, we've gotten to focus on that. I'm grateful that I'm continuing to pursue my degree and doing well in classes, that I'm continuing to be able to do research, hoping to have a publication in the next few months, and the ways in which those important things in my life have not been taken, and I still have those, has focused my thankfulness for them, because the things that are less important have, fallen away.
professionally, this year has been really good for me. I think that the pandemic actually opened some opportunities for me, which is, I suppose kind of a bittersweet reality. One that over the summer I worked as a paid remote research assistant, which, I may have had a different paid role over the summer if I might not have had to be remote, but my research really lended itself to me being able to work alone and outside because I study trees. And so it's easy to be outside. And so if there had been, if I had been competing against grants that, focused on in-lab work, I may not have actually gotten it. And so that kind of accelerated my research that I'm still working on now, and that I too might actually get a publication out in the next year, which is kind of crazy as an undergraduate that I would be involved in that. And also, I'm now working. I shoot video for my church and edit it together for our remote services. Obviously, that would not be required if we weren't during the pandemic, which has, been a source of income and fulfillment, and that it's been an interesting job. And I've definitely I did video editing and that type of stuff beforehand, but it's really forced me to, I have to produce a service or two every single week. And so I've kind of, I had the skills, but now I'm faster, I'm more efficient, and I kind of have a way to triage and work through a project. But it also has mean that I'm much more involved in my church. Even, when I lived at home and was closer to church and not at university, I wasn't going to church every week. That's just not necessarily how I or my family did things. It was just too easy to just say we're going to sleep in. But since I've got to be there for work, I am at church every single week because I got to be there for work. And that also means that I'm there in person. So there's plenty of times where I am one of 2 people that hears our sermon in person. Because it's, me, the preacher, and our sound guy. And so that has meant that I am somehow in some kind of weird, twisted way in the midst of a pandemic is the time where I'm spending the most time in my church.
That is funny.
Which is kind of weird, but it's meant that I've been weirdly more involved in my church in the middle of a pandemic than I was beforehand, which I think has been a good thing for me, which is really weird.
That is a little strange. I've definitely been less involved in church over the last 9 months, which is not something I like. I really like my church, both at home and at university. I have 2 different churches. I like them both. And I have been frustrated to not be able to take communion and to see the community and be with the community at church. But over the last 3 months, not so much while I was at home, but over the last 3 months, I've seen some personal spiritual growth, just because if I want that, I have to seek it out. I can't just show up to church every week and pretend like I'm, checking off all the boxes, so to speak.
I think working for church, I suppose not never, but in the past 4 years, I haven't been the strongest religious person out there. But I suppose working for my church has kind of forced me to be okay, you're working for a church, you might have to do some consideration here. And so I think that's just kind of that. And also even before I was working for my church, I was trying to be more intentional. And that's meant that I've just kind of put more thought and effort into figuring out where religion plays a role in my life.
Yeah. All said, there are a lot of things that we have to be thankful for this year. An awful year though it is, I think that the pain and losses bring into sharper contrast the things that are good that we can be thankful for.
Yeah, it's much easier to see the light if the room is dark.
Yeah, that's a good metaphor. So, something that's been on my mind, not just around Thanksgiving, but for several months now, but Thanksgiving has pulled this idea into sharper contrast, is the importance of gratitude and thankfulness as a person.
Yeah.
I believe it was sometime in August that I first heard someone point out that the opposite of anger is often not peace, but gratitude. That it is very difficult to be angry when you are grateful. Anger is all about what is wrong, what you don't have, what you deserve, or you focus on what's wrong. And gratitude forces you to focus on what is right and what is correct. And that idea just stuck in my head, and I spent several weeks, months mulling over it and thinking about how gratitude can be such a powerful antidote to so many negative emotions. it's hard to be sad when you're grateful, when you're thankful, and you think about the things that you do have, and you focus on the good things in your life.
Yeah, or it takes the edge off, that you can be sad about something while not getting stuck. I think gratitude often provides a path to a better future. Like, in the midst of a pandemic and everything else that's going on, it's easy to feel like you're stuck, that this is your forever. But if you can be thankful for what you have and maybe feel like that there is a good future there because of what you have now, it can be a way to take the edge off those negative emotions that are just bound to be there.
Certainly. I mentioned anger can be countered by gratitude. Another thing that popped into my head, complaining. It's so easy to fall into complaining, and I think that's just a really bad emotional space to be in. Complaining is pretty obviously the opposite of gratitude.
Yeah.
What are other negative emotions?
Yeah, what are other negative emotions? Well, I mean, in terms of my own life, I may have mentioned this on the podcast before, but like, anger has never been my issue. Like, I'm trying to think of time. Like, I am so rarely angry, especially at an individual. Like, there are times where I'm upset with a situation, and even then, I say upset. Like, so very rarely am I actually angry. I might get frustrated or sad or upset, but like, anger is such a rare emotion for me. That's not saying I'm some like super pious person. I have my issues, but they don't come out in anger. I think I more go towards like the low energy side of bad emotions. But I think that gratitude can help out there, and not even in the... James just showed me his mood tracker.
Yeah, so my mood tracker app has a list of negative emotions, and sorry, I interrupted what you were saying, but looking at all of these, I think they can all be countered with gratitude. Fear is another negative emotion. It's hard to be afraid when you recognize the good things, and you see, you've come through trials before and you've done well. That gratitude can be a counter for fear. Feeling nervous or stressed, I think gratitude is a really good way to ground yourself in what is and what has gone well,
and puts things in perspective. I think gratitude for I think stress. There are times where there are real stressors, especially now it's easy to find the stressors that are real. But I find most often the times when I am stressed, it is not about there are times where I'm stressed about what is actually important. But if I am overwhelmed by stress, it is more often the case that is like stress because I am busy with school or whatever, rather than I'm stressed with things that are actually, life or death or super critical. And I think gratitude is also a great way to just put things into perspective, because even if you just sit down and be like, okay, what is going good? What am I thankful for? You are probably going to jump to the things that are, most important. And it's cliche to be like, oh, I'm thankful for my friends and my family. If you think about that when you're stressed about your orgo problem set, it's like, oh, like, yeah, this orgo problem set's going to be a day late and I don't really know what I'm doing, but
it's not a big deal.
So what? Who cares?
Yeah.
There are so many more important things.
Certainly. And in an age where we no longer have to hope that the harvest is good enough to get us through the winter, and famine is not something that's ever on our minds, I think that Thanksgiving in some sense can feel like just a holiday of an excuse to get together with family and eat too much. But this year in particular has really forced me to think about gratitude and think about the benefit that gratitude has for me. I feel so much better. I can get rid of so many negative emotions just by being thankful.
Yeah, because I think that for both of us and many people around the world, there aren't as many obvious life or death things to be gratitude about or grateful about, in that I think that it is easy to think about being grateful for something, or maybe not even think about it this way, but it's easy to kind of fall into a mindset of only being thankful for things that are kind of not inevitable. Like, in my life, I have always felt like having enough food to eat is just inevitable for me. I just have never really felt like there was a real chance, outside of end of the world level scenarios, that I would not have enough food to eat every day. And so, of course, if I'm going to come up with a list of things that I'm thankful for, it's like that there's food on the table to eat, but that never has any real weight to it. It's kind of just like a token saying, and that being thankful for having enough food to eat, even if I try to intentionally think about it, even saying right now that I am thankful to have enough food to eat, it in some ways is hollow because I don't know anything else.
Yeah.
And so I think that in circles where, like ours, of immense privilege relative to some of the poorest people on the planet, or even our ancestors 6 generations
200 years ago. Yeah.
In some ways, our lives are pretty posh. And so the things that we are grateful for either don't have necessarily the same stakes. I would say that there is the kind of one caveat I would say to this are relationships, because I think, no matter where you look in history, humans are relational species. I just read a book about loneliness, and like even in situations now where like I would never have to worry about how much food to eat, loneliness is almost just as life and death now as it was 100 years ago. At least it feels that way. And so I think relationships are the one exception to this, that relationships still feel valuable. But
yeah,
like I don't worry about food. And so even when I intentionally think about it, even when I say it now, it's still somewhat empty, and just that it's not, I'm thankful for it, but in kind of a de facto way.
And in a similar sense, health has always been something I'm just, I'm thankful for health, thankful that I'm healthy. But this year in particular, both of my grandfathers have been in poor health, and one of them moved in with us. And to see firsthand his health struggles has made me grateful for the health that I have. And in the midst of a pandemic, it has made me grateful that he's still healthy, that he hasn't gotten COVID yet, because it would probably kill him. So being thankful for health this year doesn't feel as shallow as saying you're thankful for health in previous years.
No, I definitely echo that. I have not had any major long-term health struggles in my life, and I think seeing people around you go through their own struggles bring things into context for you. But I think also thinking about my family, one of my grandmas died about 7 months ago. And now my other grandma is undergoing chemotherapy for cancer. And so, of course there are things that I am worried about there and sad about, but, the older people in my life, my grandparents and my own parents, I'm much more thankful for their health or their relative health, kind of given this context of a year ago, I had never really had in my parents and grandparents, there was there were some risks. Like one of my grandfathers had a heart attack, but I was young when that happened, and so there had never really been a time in my life where kind of the important older figures in my life felt mortal. I had one great aunt that died a long time ago that I didn't really know, and so no one really felt mortal, and now they do, and so I'm much more thankful for that. That
Certainly.
That they are alive and healthy, or relatively healthy, those that are.
So this week is going to be a bit of a shorter episode. The topic is a little more narrow than previous ones, which explains that.
Yeah, which I'm okay with.
Certainly. This is not by any means a professional podcast.
No, it is not.
But I want to at least say to our listeners, I hope that you had a wonderful Thanksgiving. This will probably come out afterwards.
Yeah. And we're thankful for you. The limited number of you that we are thankful for you.
We are.
Because we're not just talking into a void. We're talking into a very small collection of people, but it's not a complete void, and that's something.
That is true. I will say as well, I will encourage our listeners to try and practice gratitude. It's been an awful year. The world is not a good place. And a great counter to the negative emotions that can conjure up is just gratitude. Think about what you have and be grateful for it. The Apostle Paul writes, "What do you have that you have not been given?" And so we can be grateful for everything in some sense.
Yeah. Hey, it's Noah here. As I was editing through, I just wanted to say one more time at the end of the episode, if you're listening now, thank you so much for listening. We really do appreciate it a lot, and we both hope that you had a lovely Thanksgiving, however you did that during these strange times. If you enjoyed this episode, we would absolutely love it if you would leave a review wherever you listen, or just tell someone about the podcast. If you think it's interesting or one of the topics, you want to send it to a friend, that would be amazing. But that's all that we have for you today. Our next episode should come out 2 Tuesdays-ish from now, so around December 15th.
be looking for it. I don't know what our topic will be yet, but I'm sure it will be an interesting conversation. Thank you for listening. Bye.